I will start here in the routes go file by adding another new route. Another new post route that waits for incoming post requests, in this case to post requests sent to /login. Because the idea behind this route, as the name suggests, is that we'll handle user login. Now for that, in this users go file, in the routes folder, below or above this signup request handler, I'll add another function that will serve as a request handler, and I'll name this function login. Because here I want to handle login requests. I want to connect this function to the login route. And we can actually do this right away, like this, so that this login request handler is connected to this login route here. Now, of course, in order to be a valid handler function, we must make sure that we accept this context as a parameter, because all request handler functions get that. And then in this function, we want to extract the credentials, so the email and password that were sent by the client, and we want to validate them and see whether a valid email password combination was sent. So for that, we can start by again creating another user struct instance. So here I'm creating another user variable of type models user, so of my custom user struct type here. And then, just as before for signing up, I want to bind the incoming request body to that struct. So I want to populate that struct, I want to create that struct with that data that is attached to the incoming request. Because of course, the incoming request should contain both an email and a password, because we need that in order to log a user in. Now, of course, some data might be missing, or binding this data might fail for whatever reason, and therefore, just as before, I want to handle this error and send back a bad request response if we were not able to use the request data. But after checking for that and after populating the user, it's time to validate the credentials that were sent with the request. For that, we can go to that user go file in the models folder, and here we can add a new method, and therefore we set up such a receiver where we get our user, which we could call validate credentials. Of course, the name is up to you. And the idea is, as the name suggests, to validate those credentials and see whether we got a valid email password combination. Now, in order to validate those credentials, we'll have to fetch the user for the email address that we got as part of the request here from the database, because we'll need to take a look at the database and see whether we find a user for that email address. Hence here, I'll set up a query, which is a select query, where I want to select the email and password from the users table, where the email should be equal to this placeholder, and then I'll get my row with help of my DB value here, and then the query row method to get a single row, because I know that at most one row will be found because I'm looking for a specific email, and in my database configuration, if we take a look at that, if we take a look at the users table, I made sure that the email field here, the email column, must contain unique values. So a single email address can't exist more than once in that table. And therefore I know that I will get back exactly one row, or no results at all, if the email was not found, of course. And therefore now I'll send my query here to query row, like this, and then as a follow-up argument, the value that should be injected here for this placeholder. And that, of course, will be u.email, so the email of the user on which we're calling this method. Now that row which we get back then has a scan method which we can execute to extract the data that we get back, and that data can then be used to populate this user here. Now in this case, that's not what I'll do though. Instead, I'll create a new helper variable retrieved password, and I want to bind that to the password that I found here in my database, because of course ultimately the goal will be to compare that retrieved password to the password that was set on this struct, so to the password that was part of the incoming HTTP request. Therefore, I'll just pass a pointer to retrieved password here to scan, and I'll set this to type string, of course. And hence, I actually don't even care about the email here. I don't want to get the email address. I just want to extract the password from the database, because I'm already getting the email in the request and I'm using it here to query for a user. So if I don't find anything with that query, I know that I got no user for that email. If I do find something though, I know that the email seems to be valid, and the remaining step then just is to compare the password. So the password is all I care about, hence I bind that with scan. And of course here we could be getting an error, because scan will return an error if no rows match the query, so if it didn't find anything. So therefore I know that if error is not equal to nil, we did not find a user for that email. So in that case, I want to return that error here from that method so that we can deal with it here in this login request handler function. Hence, the return type of validate credentials is error, and here I will return an error, the error I got if no user was found for that email. Otherwise, if we make it past this if check here, I know that I did find a user, I know that I now do have some password, and now we just have to compare that password to the password the user sent with the request. But that's now actually not as straightforward as it might sound. Because you must keep in mind that when we save a new user, we hash the password. So we convert the plain text password to an unreadable, random looking string of characters which can't be converted back. That's important. So how can we now compare this strange hash value to the plain text password that will of course have been sent to the login route? Because if a user logs in, of course they send their plain text password with the request. And now we have to compare that plain text password to the hashed password. Well, thankfully that is fairly easy to do. Because whilst we can't convert the hash back to the raw plaintext password, we can take the plaintext password that we got on the login route and see if this hash, which we stored in the database, could have been generated from that password, which will tell us that the password is valid. And this bcrypt library, which we're using for hashing, makes that comparison quite straightforward. In this utils hash.go file, we can add a new function, check password hash could be the name, where I get my plain text password and the hashed password as input parameters, both of type string, and where I will return a Boolean value, true if the password is valid, false if it's invalid. And then we can use this bcrypt package here and use the compare hash and password method or function that's built into this package to compare this plain text password to the hashed password. Now it wants such byte slices instead of strings, but as you saw before, you can easily create those by using these comparison functions that are built into Go. And then the first argument actually must be the hashed password. So I'll start by sending this as a byte slice into this function. And then the second argument is the plain text password converted to such a byte slice. And as a result, I might get back an error if it fails to validate the password. So if the password we got, the plain text password, does not fit the hashed password that we checked it against. And therefore here, I will return error equals nil, because that will give me true if the password is valid and if we have no error. And if we have some error, I don't care about the error, but instead by returning this operation here, I'm returning false if the password is invalid. Because error will be nil if the password is valid, and it will not be nil if the password is invalid. So this will yield false if the password is invalid. And therefore now we can use this utility method here in UserGo to check whether we have a valid password.